Research methods of psychology. The main objectives in this lesson are to understand what is scientific research and its importance, research methods used in psychology, the introspection method, observation method, and the case study method. Now let us understand scientific research in psychology. People have always been curious about the natural world, including themselves and their behavior. Science grew out of this natural curiosity and has become the best way to achieve detailed and accurate knowledge. Keep in mind that most of the phenomena and theories that fill in psychology textbooks are the products of scientific research. In a typical undergraduate psychology textbook, for example, one can learn about sensation and perception, principles of classic and operant conditioning, personality traits and theories, motivation and drives. Scientific research is often classified as being either basic or applied. Basic research psychology is conducted primarily for the sake of achieving more detailed and accurate understanding of human behavior. Applied research is conducted primarily to address some practical problem. The reasons to use these steps in the scientific method are: the goals of psychological studies are to describe, explain, predict, and possibly influence mental processes or behaviors. In order to do this, psychologists utilize the scientific method to conduct psychological research. The scientific method is a set of principles and procedures that are used by researchers to develop questions, collect data, and reach conclusions. The steps of the scientific method, while research studies can differ, these are the basic steps that psychologists and even scientists use when investigating human behavior. Step 1. Make an observation. Before a researcher can begin, they must choose a topic to study. Once an area of interest has been chosen, the researchers must then conduct a thorough review of the existing literature on the subject. This review will provide valuable information about what has already been learned about the topic and what questions remain to be answered. A literature review might involve looking at a considerable amount of written material from both books and academic journals dating back decades. This background material will also help the researcher with the first major step in conducting a psychological study, that is, formulating a hypothesis. Step 2. Ask a question. Once a researcher has observed something and gained some background information on the topic, the next step is to ask a question. The researcher will form a hypothesis, which is an educated guess about the relationship between two or more variables. Step 3. Test your hypothesis and collect data. Once you have a solid hypothesis, the next step of the scientific method is to put this hunch to test by collecting data. The exact methods used to investigate a hypothesis depend on exactly what is being studied. There are two basic forms of research that a psychologist may utilize: descriptive research or experimental research. Descriptive research is typically used when it would be difficult or even impossible to manipulate the variables in question. Correlational studies are quite common in psychological research. While they do not allow researchers to determine cause and effect, they do make it possible to spot relationships between different variables and to measure the strength of those relationships. Experimental research is used to explore cause and effect relationship between two or more variables. This type of research involves systematically manipulating an independent variable and then measuring the effect that it has on a defined dependent variable. One of the major advantages of this method is that it allows researchers to actually determine if changes in one variable actually cause changes in another. While psychological experiments are often quite complex, a simple experiment is fairly basic but does allow researchers to determine cause and effect relationships between variables. Most simple experiments use a control group, those who do not receive the treatment, and an experimental group, those who do receive the treatment. Step 4. Examine the results and draw conclusions. Once a researcher has designed the study and collected the data, it is time to examine this information and draw conclusions about what has been. Using statistics, researchers can summarize the data, analyze the results, and draw conclusions based on these evidences. After conclusions have been drawn, the next step is to share the results with the rest of the scientific community. This is an important part of the process because it contributes to the overall knowledge base and can help other scientists find new research avenues to explore. Now that we have understood the basic process and purpose of scientific research, let us look at the different methods of research in psychology. They are introspection method, observation method, and case study method. The first research method that we will understand is the introspection method. Introspection method. Introspection, from Latin 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧, means to look within. The process of observing the operations of one's own mind with a view to discovering the laws that govern the mind. Introspection is a process that involves looking inward to examine one's own thoughts and emotions. The term is often used in everyday language to refer to the informal processes of exploring one's inner life, but the term also applies to a more formalized process that was once used as an experimental technique in psychology. The introspection concept explores inner thoughts and feelings following a unique structure of analysis. As the concept was further researched, it became a formalized approach in psychology to assist others that would encourage a better understanding of one's thoughts and actions from the past. Introspection is significant because it promotes and sustains a positive direction for mental growth and development. As a research technique, the term introspection is also used to describe a research technique that was first developed by the psychologist William Wundt, also known as experimental self-observation. Wundt's technique involved training people to carefully and objectively as possible to analyze the content of their own thoughts. Some historians suggest that introspection is not the most accurate term to refer to the methods that Wundt utilized. Introspection implies a level of armchair soul searching, but the methods that Wundt used were a much more highly controlled and rigid experimental technique. 𝗹𝗶𝗁𝗂, a student of Wundt, also utilized this technique, although he has been accused of mispresenting many of Wundt's original ideas. While Wundt was interested in looking at the conscious experiences as a whole, 𝗪𝗏 instead focused on breaking down mental experiences into individual components and asked individuals to describe their mental experiences of events. The method is also used in the explanation of experiences in studies of perception and in psychophysics, which defines the relation of conscious events, usually of a sensory nature, to magnitudes of the stimulus, especially in the determination of the sensory thresholds and sensory scales. In addition, the method is used in the reports of patients as they describe their conscious states to psychiatrists and psychoanalysts during free association. Now, let us look at the benefits of introspection method. While introspection has fallen out of favor as a research technique, there are many potential benefits to this sort of self-reflection and self-analysis. Introspection can be a great source of information on mental processes and personal knowledge. The process provides knowledge that is not possible in any other way. It can help people make connections between different experiences and responses. For the use of introspection method, no laboratory or test materials are required. So, introspection method can be used at any time and at any place. The subjective observation method provides an opportunity to check the results obtained through other methods. Criticisms of introspection method. While Wundt's experimental techniques did a great deal to advance the cause of making psychology a more scientific discipline, the introspective method had a number of notable limitations. The use of introspection as an experimental technique was often criticized, particularly Titchener's use of the method. Schools of thought, including functionalism and behaviorism, believe that introspection lacked scientific reliability and objectivity. Because the process is so subjective, it is impossible to examine or repeat the result. A few other limitations with introspection method are: different observers often provide significantly different responses to the exact same stimuli. Even the most highly trained observers were not consistent in their responses. Introspection is limited in its use. Complex subjects such as learning, personality, mental disorders, and development are difficult or even impossible to study with this technique. The technique is difficult to use with children and impossible to use with animals. The very act of analyzing one's own thoughts plays a role in changing the experience. Most people would not like to reveal their private experiences, such as the feelings of guilt and shame. The report in such cases would be distorted. A person cannot observe his unconscious mental processes, which means that the methods of subjective observation leaves out a large chunk of relevant mental experiences. Also, because observers have to first be trained by the researchers, there is always the possibility that this training introduces a bias to the results. Those engaged in introspection might be thinking or feeling things because of how they have been influenced and trained by the experimenters. While evaluating the self and others, people give greater weight to introspection about themselves while judging others on their outward behavior. The problem is that even when introspections don't provide useful or accurate information, people remain confident that their introspections are correct, a phenomenon known as the introspection illusion. The use of introspection as a tool for looking inward is as important part of self-awareness and is even used in psychotherapy as a way to help clients gain insight into their own feelings and behavior. While Wundt's efforts contributed a great deal to the development and advancement of experimental psychology, researchers now recognize the numerous limitations and pitfalls of using introspection as an experimental technique. The next method is the observational method. Now, what is observational research? The term observational research is used to refer to several different types of non-experimental studies in which behavior is systematically observed and recorded. The goal of observational research is to describe a variable or a set of variables. As mentioned previously, observational research is non-experimental because nothing is manipulated or controlled, and as such we cannot arrive at causal conclusions using this approach. The data that are collected in observational research studies are often qualitative in nature, but they may also be quantitative or both mixed methods. There are several different types of observational methods. Today we will be discussing about them. They are naturalistic observation, participant observation, and structured observation. Naturalistic observation method. It is an observational method that involves observing people's behavior in the environment in which it typically occurs. Thus, naturalistic observation is a type of field research. Jane Goodall's famous research on chimpanzees is a classic example of naturalistic observation. Dr. Goodall spent 3 decades observing chimpanzees in their natural environment in East Africa. She examined such things as chimpanzees' social structure, mating patterns, gender roles, family structure, and care of offspring by observing them in the wild. Researchers engaged in naturalistic observation usually make their observations as unobtrusively as possible so that participants are not aware that they are being studied. Such an approach is called disguised naturalistic observation. Ethically considered to be acceptable if the participants remain anonymous and the behavior occurs in a public setting where people would not normally have an exception of privacy. In cases where it is not ethically or practical to conduct disguised naturalistic observation, researchers can conduct undisguised naturalistic observation where the participants are made aware of researchers' presence and monitoring of their behavior. However, one concern with undisguised naturalistic observation is reactivity. Reactivity is to when a measure changes participants' behavior. In the case of undisguised naturalistic observation, the concern with reactivity is that when people know they are being observed and studied, they may act differently than they normally would. This type of reactivity is known as the Hawthorne effect. Strengths. By being able to observe the flow of behavior in its own settings, studies have greater ecological validity. Like case studies, naturalistic observation is often used to generate new ideas. Because it gives the researcher the opportunity to study the total situation, it often suggests avenues of inquiry not thought of before. Limitations. The observations are often conducted on a micro or small scale and may lack a representative sample that is biased in relation to age, gender, social class, or ethnicity. This may result in the findings lacking the ability to be generalized to wider society. Natural observations are less reliable as other variables cannot be controlled. This makes it difficult for another researcher to repeat the study in exactly the same way. A further disadvantage is that the researcher needs to be trained to be able to recognize aspects of a situation that are psychologically significant and worth further attention. With observations, we do not have manipulations of variables or control over extraneous variables, which means causes and effect relationships cannot be established. Participant observation. Another approach to data collection in observational research is participant observation. In participant observation, researchers become active participants in the group or situation they are studying. Participant observation is very similar to naturalistic observation in that it involves observing people's behavior in the environment in which it typically occurs. As with naturalistic observation, the data that are collected can include interviews, usually unstructured, notes based on their observations, and interactions, documents, photographs, and other artifacts. The only difference between naturalistic observation and participant observation is that researchers engaged in participant observation become active members of the group or situations they are studying. The basic rationale for participant observation is that there may be important information that is only accessible to or can be interpreted only by someone who is an active participant in the group or situation. One of the primary benefits of participant observation is that the researchers are in a much better position to understand the viewpoint and experiences of the people they are studying when they are a part of the social group. The primary limitation with this approach is that the mere presence of the observer could affect the behavior of the people being observed. While this is a concern with naturalistic observation, additional concerns arise when researchers become active members of the social group they are studying. Because of that, they may change the social dynamics and or influence the behavior of the people they are studying. Structured observation. Another observational method is structured observation. Here, the investigator makes careful observation of one or more specific behaviors in a particular setting that is more structured than the settings used in naturalistic or participant observation. Often the setting in which the observations are made is not the natural setting. Instead, the researcher may observe people in the laboratory environment. Alternatively, the researcher may observe people in a natural setting like a classroom setting that they have structured some way. For instance, by introducing some specific task participants are to engage in, or by introducing a specific social situation or manipulation. Structured observation is very similar to naturalistic observation and participant observation in that in all three cases researchers are observing naturally occurring behavior. However, the emphasis in structured observation is on gathering quantitative rather than qualitative data. Researchers using this approach are interested in a limited set of behaviors. This allows them to quantify the behaviors they are observing. In other words, structured observation is less global than naturalistic or participant observation because the researcher engaged in structured observation is interested in a small number of specific behaviors. Therefore, rather than recording everything that happens, the researcher only focuses on very specific behaviors of interest. The strengths of structured or controlled observations are: controlled observations can be easily replicated by other researchers by using the same observation schedule. This means it is easy to test for reliability. The data obtained from structured observations is easier and quicker to analyze as it is quantitative, that is numerical, making this a less time-consuming method compared to naturalistic observation. Controlled observations are fairly quick to conduct, which means that many observations can take place within a short amount of time. This means a large sample can be obtained, resulting in the findings being representative and having the ability to be generalized to a large population. The limitations are: controlled observations can lack validity due to the Hawthorne effect or demand characteristics. When participants know they are being watched, they may act differently. The next method of study is case study method. What is case study research method? Case studies are in-depth investigations of a single person, group, event or community. Typically, data are gathered from a variety of sources and by using several different methods. The case study research method originated in clinical medicine. The case history, that is, the patient's personal history. In psychology, case studies are often confined to the study of a particular individual. The information is mainly biographical and relates to events in the individual's past, that is retrospective, as well as to significant events which are currently occurring in his or her everyday life. The case study is not itself a research method, but researchers select methods of data collection and analysis that will generate material suitable for case studies. How is a case study conducted? The procedure used in a case study means that the researcher provides a description of the behavior. This comes from interviews and other sources, such as observation. The client also reports detail of events from his or her point of view. The researcher then writes up the information from both sources above as the case study and interprets this information. Among the sources of data the psychologist is likely to turn to when carrying out a case study are observations of a person's daily routine, unstructured interviews with the participant himself and with people who know her, diaries, personal notes. The case study method often involves simply observing what happens to or reconstructing the case history of a single participant or group of individuals, such as a school class or a specific social group, that is, the idiographic approach. The interview is also an extremely effective procedure for obtaining information about an individual, and it may be used to collect comments from the person's friends, parents, employer, workmates, and others who have a good knowledge of the person, as well as to obtain facts from the person, him or herself. Most of the information is likely to be qualitative, that is, verbal description rather than measurement, but the psychologist might collect numerical data as well. Now, how to analyze case study data? The data collected can be analyzed using different theories. Example: grounded theory, interpretative phenomenological analysis, text interpretation. Example: thematic coding. All the approaches mentioned here use preconceived categories in the analysis and they are idiographic in their approach. That is, they focus on the individual cases without reference to a comparison group. Interpreting the information means the researcher decides what to include or leave out. A good case study should always make clear which information is the factual description and which is an inference or the opinion of the researcher. Strengths of case studies: they provide detailed, that is, rich qualitative information. They provide insights for further research. They permit investigation of otherwise impractical or unethical situations. Case studies allow a researcher to investigate a topic in far more detail than might be possible if they were trying to deal with a large number of research participants, that is the nomothetic approach, with the aim of averaging. Research which only looks into the measurable aspects of human behavior is not likely to give us insights into the subjective dimension to experience, which is so important to psychoanalytic and human psychologists. Case studies are often used in exploratory research. They can help us generate new ideas that might be tested by other methods. Limitations of case studies: they lack in scientific rigor and providing little basis for generalization of results to the wider population. Researchers' own subjective feeling may influence the case study, that is, researcher bias. It is difficult to replicate. It is time consuming and expensive. The volume of data together with the time restrictions in place impact on the depth of analysis that was possible within the available resources. Because a case study deals with only one person, event or group, we can never be sure if the case study investigated is representative of the wider body of similar instances. This means the conclusions drawn from a particular case may not be transferable to other settings. Summary: through this lesson, we have understood what is scientific research and the process of scientific research. The introspection method, the case study method, and the observation method form an integral part of this scientific research that psychologists use to understand the different phenomena that occur in our everyday life.